Good afternoon. My name is Professor Andrew McIntosh, and I'm the head of the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment at Monash University. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's presentation, Australia, We Need to Talk About Our Soils, by Associate Professor Vanessa Wong. Australian Indigenous people invented sustainable land use, and it's particularly fitting to deliver this acknowledgement of country for today's talk. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land we're presenting from today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I hope that as a society we pay more attention to our Indigenous peoples and the expert knowledge that they hold about the land, including fire management. Thank you to our alumni and stakeholders for joining us. The Faculty of Science has more than 38,000 science alumni, and we're very proud of our students and alumni. And we want to stay connected with you and to share the latest research and news from around the world and from Monash Science. And even though we can't meet in person at this time, we still want to connect and add value to our community. So just a little bit of housekeeping for today. The Q&A will happen after the presentation. And to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And remember to up your vote, the favourite questions that you have. Alumni Manager Claire O'Grady will be monitoring the questions and chats, and we'll join you at the end of the session for the Q&A. And we'll try to get through as many questions as the time allows. So first, a little bit more about our school. The School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment formed a little over 5 years ago from the combination of physical geography, atmospheric sciences and geology at Monash. We're one of the top earth science schools in the country, and we have ERA rankings of 5 in a number of fields. We've got highly cited scientists like Peter Kaywood, who's a laureate fellow, and Julie Arblaster, who was recently promoted to full professor. Our school is a vibrant community of several hundred, including academics and professional staff, postdocs and PhD students. If we return to the office at some point, I recommend that you visit us and see our Earth Sciences garden. Our motto is "The world is our lab," and our world usually is our lab, but right now we're stuck under curfew, so we're not really going anywhere. Usually we go all the way from, at least virtually, the Earth's core to the top of its atmosphere, from the tropics to the Antarctic ice sheet, from the highest mountains to the deepest ocean trenches. And our science is key to understanding and exploring our solar system as well. Our school's focused on the future. We aim to educate the next generation of geoscientists and environmental scientists to understand our future and to make good decisions for society and our planet. This includes leading research and education on the processes that have shaped the Earth since its formation, from which we source critical mineral resources that are needed to power a renewable energy future, the fundamental weather and climate science required to predict changes in the atmosphere, oceans, ice sheets, sea level, and so on, and the impacts of environmental changes on cities, forests, coasts, rivers, water, and of course soil, which is the topic of today's talk by Vanessa. So it's now time to introduce Vanessa. You're going to switch your camera on. You're all good to go? Yep. So Associate Professor Vanessa Wong is a certified soil scientist in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment at Monash. Her research explores the spatial and temporal interactions between soils, sediments and water at a range of scales. She's interested in the role of soil, surface water, shallow groundwater processes, ranging from the micron scale, so really small, to landscape scale, and she seeks to understand landscape function and how biogeochemical processes occur in a range of different environments. Dr. Wong works closely with industry, government organisations, local, state and federal, and catchment management authorities to develop and apply findings from her research to improve land and water management strategies. Vanessa also serves her community as Federal Vice President of Soil Science Australia, Deputy Chair of the EMCR Forum Executive, Vice Chair of the Acid Sulphate Soils Working Group, IUSS, Editor-in-Chief of Land Degradation and Development, and Associate Editor of Wetlands. Phew, that's quite a list there, Vanessa. So it's now time to listen to Vanessa speak about Australia. We need to talk about our soils. So thank you very much, and that's all out from me.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you for that introduction. Today, we're going to be talking about soils, and I love talking about soils. So what I'm going to do today is step through some, I guess, some significant land degradation or soil management issues that have affected Australia in the more recent past, and touch on where we're going as we head into the future. And so before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And this is quite fitting really, because when we're talking about land management and soil management, we generally tend to focus on what has happened in the more recent past, so time since European arrival. And in terms of land management, we need to also recognise that the Indigenous people were the traditional custodians of the land. And this quote from a book about Australian Aboriginal views of landscape and wilderness, I think is quite apt for this seminar. And it comes from April Bright, who says that it is part of our responsibility to be looking after our country. If you don't look after country, country won't look after you. And I think we're really sort of at, we're really at that tail end of this quote, because now we want to try and encourage our country to look after us. So healthy soils are critically important to our environment and our economy and our society. So we need healthy soils to provide the food that we eat, the fibre for the clothes that we wear, and also healthy soils to provide the base on which the infrastructure is based and for our cities to be built on. So it's really, really important to understand what happens below ground. More broadly, healthy soils are really important in addressing some of those sustainable development goals. And soils really are instrumental in 4 of the 17 sustainable development goals, looking specifically at zero hunger. So again, providing the food that we eat. Soils are really important for to act as a filter, to provide clean water and sanitation, and interacts with these with life below water and also life on land. And I'll touch on each of these during this seminar. Importantly, soils also indirectly contribute to 4 other sustainable development goals, and looking specifically at issues associated with climate action, infrastructure, our sustainable cities, and also responsible consumption and production. So when we talk about soils, we also need to recognise that soils are incredibly diverse, and they're not just diverse in terms of the types of soils that we see around the world and around Australia, but also in terms of the ecosystems in which they support. 1 teaspoon of productive soil generally contains between 100 million and 1 billion bacteria, or about 50,000 species of bacteria. And this is really important because we're only really just scratching the surface in terms of understanding the biodiversity below ground and looking at what potential benefits the below ground ecosystem can provide, and also what the species are. We actually don't really even know what they are. Increasingly though, our land management activities are degrading soils, which cause substantial declines in this biodiversity. And so we may not ever know what we have lost because we don't know what's there to start with. We need to try and do more with less. So by 2050, the expected population of the world is predicted to be about 9.7 billion, coming from the UN projections. And increasingly, we need to use a finite amount of land to support these 9.7 billion people around the world. If we look at the amount of land that's available for food production, about 29% of the Earth's surface is land, with the rest of the area covered by oceans. And of that 29%, about 71% is habitable land. And from there, of that 71%, only 50% is currently used for agriculture. And I'd also like to draw your attention to this 1% here. So this 1% is the area in which we live. So this is urban and built up land. Increasingly though, we need to produce more food to feed the growing population with increasingly less land, so a smaller area of land. And the amount of arable land that's available per person is declining, and it's declining worldwide, and it's declining in every single in every single continent. And it's not just that the world's population is increasing, but it's also because the land itself is being degraded. So we need to produce more food on increasingly more marginal land. What's also challenging is this 1% of land, so our urban and built up areas, is gradually expanding. And so if you look at our cities, particularly in Australia, so looking at Melbourne, for example, the expansion of urban areas and the growth of our cities is starting to expand into some very productive agricultural land. Our cities are located on fertile land or fertile farmland, and that's why they were sited there to start with. So as our population grows, we're starting to encroach into these into the food bowl of our cities. So it is increasingly challenging now to increase agricultural productivity as we shift agriculture into increasingly less fertile land. And it's been quite problematic, so problematic, in fact, that back in 1949, the Victorian Premier, Henry Bolt, said that we could not have made a bigger mess of the soil of the country if its destruction had been carried out under supervision. And he said this back in 1949 when he established the state soil conservation surveys. And it was around this time that each of the states, individual states, set up their own soil conservation surveys. And the reason why they set up these conservation surveys was due to issues associated with excessive erosion. And so this is a dust storm coming in to Broken Hill in 1930, and then another dust storm coming into Mildura in 1940. And these dust storms were reasonably common around the 1930s and 1940s, and sort of had really come to a climax. They started, or the issues of dust storms started around the turn of the century, tied into the Federation drought. So as the amount of moisture in the soils declined, plant productivity, plant growth also declined, and excessive clearing for expansion of farmland also meant that our soils were left bare or uncovered, which increased their susceptibility to wind erosion. So during this time, entire topsoil horizons were blown away, and sand was deposited in our capital cities. So Sydney and Melbourne were also blanketed in dust. And there was significant loss in crops and cattle and sheep flocks during this time, and also a substantial decline in agricultural productivity. So it's been 80 to 90 years since since we've recognised these issues with erosion, and quite some time since these soil conservation surveys have been established or formed. So where are we now in terms of looking at soil erosion? When we look specifically at soil erosion, in terms of the rate of soil erosion, under equilibrium conditions or under steady state conditions, soil formation or soil formation rates equal soil erosion rates, where everything is in equilibrium. Except now, once you shift that equilibrium by removing the surface cover or removing the native vegetation, or just removing vegetation cover in general, soil erosion starts to dominate, or the rates of soil loss start to dominate. When we're talking about soil formation, soil forms at an incredibly slow rate. So soil forms at a rate of about 0.1 to 1 tonne per hectare per year. So it seems like quite a lot, 1 tonne of soil forming per year, except to give you a bit of an idea of how much soil that is, a 1 millimetre depth of soil across that hectare is about 14 tonnes. So these soil formation rates mean that we're forming soils at a rate of less than 1 millimetre per hectare per year. When erosion occurs, the topsoil, or the A horizon, is a layer that is often lost, and that makes sense because it's the uppermost layer. It's also the most fertile layer of soil. It's the layer where the nutrient concentrations are the highest. It's also the layer where organic matter content is also the highest as well, which has significant impacts for processes like carbon sequestration. Because if you're losing that topsoil layer, then you're also losing organic matter, you're losing organic carbon, and we're also losing those nutrients held within the topsoil. Current rates of water erosion now exceed soil formation rates by an order of magnitude. And so this figure here gives you an example of where soil erosion is occurring as a function of water erosion. So this figure only shows you water erosion. If we were to include issues or areas affected by wind erosion, which is relevant to those big dust storms, these areas through inland Australia would become much more important. So in terms of current rates of water erosion, they vastly exceed rates of soil formation by an order of magnitude, particularly in these wetter areas along the coastal regions of our eastern seaboard, and up here in the Ord Valley, which is currently opening up for agriculture. And at current rates of erosion, we have potentially less than 500 years until the A horizon, or our topsoil, is completely lost to erosion on up to 10 million hectares of land. And again, once we lose that topsoil, it's very challenging to get the nutrients back into the soil to establish or re-establish plant growth in our subsoil horizons due to lower concentrations of nutrients and generally much more compact subsoil horizons. So in terms of erosion, we really want to try and arrest that loss of topsoil. A number of land degradation issues also exacerbate soil erosion. And the first of those is dryland salinity. And dryland salinity has been called a silent crisis or soil cancer. And that's because when you return to an area year after year, the area that's affected by dryland salinity or salinity gradually increases. You don't see what's happening, but all you see is this expansion of this salt-affected land. Our soils are naturally saline anyway, and again, under equilibrium conditions, the concentrations of salt, the vegetation processes, and groundwater levels are all in equilibrium. So, so everything sits in the landscape and cycles in equilibrium. But now we've changed our landscape. Our landscapes are now quite leaky. And so dryland salinity or salinization brought about by dryland salinity occurs with the removal of native vegetation, primarily for agriculture. It's replacement with shallow-rooted crops and pastures, which allows for excess water to enter into the soil profile, leach beyond the root zone of plants to hit the water table. And once it hits the water table, it causes the groundwater to rise and then to mobilize salts to bring them up into the root zone of plants. Once the water table reaches to about 1 to 2 meters of the land surface, then processes like capillary rise and evapotranspiration continues to pull groundwater up from the subsurface, and then results in it also results in bringing up salts along with it. And during dry conditions, these salts start to precipitate on the surface to increase surface salinity, and also to form these salt crusts. High salt concentrations affect microbial activity at the land surface, and that sort of again makes sense. It results in desiccation of bacteria and fungi, and also decreases their activity. Because the microbial biomass or soil microbes are fundamental for nutrient cycling and for carbon storage, then those two processes are also impacted as well. So in areas that are affected by salinity, these bare scalded areas start to form, which means that you have no vegetation input, no organic matter input, and low concentrations low activity rates in terms of the microbial biomass. In extreme cases like what you see here, and this is an example from northwestern Victoria, vegetation death occurs, and again, you lose that biotic input. Back in 2000, it was recognised that salinity or dryland salinity was a really significant issue. $1.4 billion of funding under the Howard government was put into the National Action Plan for Salinity and Water Quality. We had the National Land and Water Resources Audit, and we also had a range of other national dryland salinity programs. In WA, it was sort of it was expressed that an area the size of a football field was salinising, or subject to salinisation per hour. So it was a really, really significant issue back in 2000, and it was a period where we had about 10 years of funding to look specifically at dryland salinity. Our current estimates of the aerial extent and cost of salinity are nearly a decade out of date. So since the 2000s and that decade of critical research, those initiatives has really started to peter off and to disappear, and it started to disappear around towards the end of the decade in around 2008. And that was partly because we were in the throes of a millennium drought. And where you have drought conditions, or where you have less water in the landscape, it's very difficult for the salts to move around in the landscape. So the issue started to drift off the radar. And so once you have limited salt movement, it means that potentially maybe it wasn't, in terms of perceptions, it wasn't such a significant issue. But other issues started to arise during that millennium drought. So the millennium drought, which the Bureau of Meteorology defines as the period between 1996 and 2010, resulted in significantly decreased amounts of rainfall, and down in the lower lakes region of the Murray River, disconnected 33 wetlands. So the Murray Lake, the lower lakes and the Coorong and Murray Mouth is an area of significant international habitat. There are Ramsar listed wetlands there. And a series of interconnected wetlands. And during that drought, 33 of those wetlands became disconnected and started to dry out. The lower lakes, so Lakes Alexandrina and Lake Albert, reached their lowest point in terms of surface water levels in over 1,000 years. So, Lake Alexandrina, which is what you can see here in terms of the water levels, dropped to below 1.1 metres below sea level back in April 2009. And this again was a significant issue, largely because it starts to expose a whole lot of areas which have previously not been exposed to the atmosphere in the past. These areas are freshwater wetlands. So the reason why the sea didn't come rushing in was due to the construction, or due to the presence of barrages at the Murray Mouth. So as water levels dropped, we ended up with this significant acidification issue. So acidification of soils and surface waters resulted as due to these lower water levels. And you can see from this example here, this is just a pH strip, a litmus strip that that was taken from the surface of the exposed lake bed, and it has a pH of 2.5. That is incredibly low for these environments. And it also resulted in extreme salinisation of soils and surface water. Again, remembering that this is a freshwater system. So as water evaporates, it results in a relative concentration of the remaining salts, which can result in salinisation. So just a bit of a note in terms of acidification. When we talk about acidification in Australia, we can refer to acidification in two senses. So one is the acidification of soils in broadacre agricultural regions, which is tied to the use of nitrogenous fertilisers. And the other is the processes of acidification, which I'm about to go through. So in this particular case, 20,000 hectares of acid sulfate soils were exposed. And once those acid sulfate soils were exposed, we ended up with this coating of various adjacent lakes and creeks and tributaries with these iron oxide flocks, or these iron coatings. So acid sulfate soils, they're the world's nastiest soils. They're defined as soils soils and sediments which contain primarily metal sulfides, and this is dominated by pyrite, which is an iron disulfide mineral, so FeS2. if they remain anoxic or covered in water or waterlogged, they're relatively benign. So, so they remain in a sulfidic state when they're waterlogged. When they're exposed to oxygen, such as when water levels drop, sulfuric acid can be generated through oxidation of pyrite. And then once oxidation occurs, there's a whole range of processes that then start to kick off, which then result in a low pH in both surface water or the overlying surface water, the low pH in the sediments themselves, soils and sediments themselves, high concentrations of acidity, high concentrations of salinity, and also high concentrations of heavy metals, because heavy metals become much more mobile in low pH conditions. So in terms of the overall reaction, in these environments, you have pyrite, which is FeS2. Like I said, is relatively benign in waterlogged conditions. When it's exposed to oxygen, to form colloidal iron or iron oxides and sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid is what drops the pH. But also this colloidal iron is really significant and highly problematic because it forms these iron flocks that you can see in orange here, and it coats the benthos. So it coats the base of river channels and creek beds and essentially suffocates whatever's living down on the base of the channel. So, so the formation of these colloidal flocks or iron flocks is highly problematic. Acid sulfate soils occur in all of our environments. So they occur in natural environments, in wetlands, for example, in wetlands, swamps, mangrove environments, salt marsh environments. They occur in agricultural landscapes and also in urban settings. And if you've ever put in a development application to council, there's a little box that you can tick where it says requires an acid sulfate soil management plan. This is the reason why. So if you have acid sulfate soils that underlie your property and you want to excavate for whatever reason, you need an acid sulfate soil management plan because of the issues that, that they create. So oxidation and oxidation of acid sulfate soils or sulfidic sediments and acidification, like I said, results in heavy metal contamination, not just of soils, but of the waterways themselves. And then over long periods of time can result in diseases in aquatic organisms. And in extreme cases, you end up with these fish kill events. So this is an example from up in Ballina, but also down in Victoria, these sorts of events occur quite regularly or semi-regularly in areas or in estuaries along the Great Ocean Road. So, so it's an issue that's common around the world, around Australia. Because it generates sulfuric acid and drops the pH, it can also impact on infrastructure to cause concrete cancer, and then affects the stability of our infrastructure and the foundations of our infrastructure. So this area through here is a Ballina bypass. From the Pacific Highway up on the far north coast of New South Wales, where they can't cross across to Queensland. So the Pacific Highway is built, parts of the Pacific Highway is built on acid sulfate soils. And in Victoria, a little bit closer to home, the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, the Westgate Tunnel, and also sections along the Level Railway crossing removal projects along the Frankston line also intersect with acid sulfate soils. So, so it's quite a significant issue. And coastal acid sulfate soils underlie all of our capital cities. So any of these activities which expose these sulfidic sediments to the atmosphere will result in oxidation. So activities like dredging, drainage, excavation, and also natural processes or natural events like drought can also result in the oxidation of coastal acid sulfate soils. Again, back in the 2000s, there were significant issues associated with oxidation, the discharge of acidity, which then impacted on the fishing and oyster industry up on the far north coast of New South Wales. There were significant issues or significant concerns in terms of the impact of acidification and acid discharge on World Heritage areas such as the Great Barrier Reef. And so as a result, a national strategy here was also formed. So the National Strategy for acid sulfate soil management and the formation of NatCas, which is the National Committee for Acid Sulfate Soils. It was also formed back in the 2000s. And in 2008, this committee expanded to include issues associated with inland acid sulfate soils. So it's not just an issue that affects coastal areas, but it also affects inland areas as well. And again, since the 2000s, research activity in this area has decreased somewhat. So these coastal acid sulfate soils also intersect with intuitively coastal environments. And coastal environments are also increasing in terms of their relevance to research in the form of carbon research. So this is largely revolved around a focus on blue carbon and the storage of blue carbon. And blue carbon environments are coastal environments such as seagrass environments, mangroves and salt marsh environments that can store and capture organic carbon. So this is an example from a site around Western Port Bay. And I had an honours student complete her research project at this site. And I think she actually sampled on this island just here. But she wasn't sampling for blue carbon, she was sampling for acid sulfate soils. So there is that intersection in terms of acid sulfate soils and these blue carbon environments, which we haven't yet unpacked. So carbon storage in coastal environments largely occurs via the trapping of deposited sediment and growth and expansion of root networks. So, so the vegetation here, in terms of the salt marsh here, can trap sediment as it's during tidal cycles, and that sediment can also include organic matter because the flow of water decreases as it hits the vegetation. And carbon can also be stored through the expansion of root networks. So as the roots as the root networks expand through growth, they grow down into the soils, and then either put out root exudates, or they grow and then die off, and effectively that organic matter is stored below ground. But not all soil carbon is created equal. So when we store carbon, we want to store carbon in a form that isn't decomposed, because if we decompose organic matter, we convert that organic matter into carbon dioxide, which is then released to the atmosphere. We want to keep that organic matter in the form of a particulate organic matter, or in a solid form, so that it's not decomposed. And we can store carbon in a number of different ways, or in a number of different fractions. So organic carbon can be stored in this, what we call a labile form or a particulate form. And this is relatively fresh or organic carbon or organic matter. So it's organic matter that is freshly deposited onto the land surface. And then potentially, because it's relatively fresh, it's also relatively easy to decompose it. So microbes can access this soil organic matter. When we give microbes labile or fresh residues, they can actually decompose it really quickly. So it's kind of like if I gave all of you a handful of jelly beans. So if I gave you the jelly beans, you would consume the jelly beans, and you would get this rush of energy because we can consume and we can process those sugars really quickly. And it's the same with carbon. So that fresh carbon, or that fresh organic matter, can be broken down really quickly. We want to store carbon in terrestrial ecosystems as humus carbon, and that's much more resistant to decomposition. So, when we give microbes something that's a little bit more resistant or more difficult to decompose, it's much harder for them to break it down, and that's when it can be stored in our soils. And this is similar to if I gave all of you a bunch of celery to eat for lunch. So that celery has a lot of lignin in it. It takes a long time to break down, and it takes a long time to digest. And so this is the form of organic matter that we want to store, because it takes a lot longer to break down and to convert into carbon dioxide. And then we have this stable, or the protected, or more resistant pool, which takes a lot longer to decompose. So not all carbon is created equal. And when we're talking about soil carbon and how we store carbon, blue carbon environments and terrestrial soil carbon environments are actually quite different. So when we're talking about these coastal environments or blue carbon environments, we can actually store a lot more of this labile component. But when we're talking about terrestrial soil carbon, which is the area that we tend to focus on when we're talking about changing agricultural practices, we want to focus generally on storing more of this slow carbon or more resistant carbon pools because of the different processes and the way that the microbes behave in these different environments. There has been a significant amount of interest and research again looking at soil carbon sequestration, how to best store carbon. And a lot of that focus has been on terrestrial soil carbon sequestration, shifting our agricultural land management practices to increase the amount of carbon that we store in our soils. But terrestrial soil carbon sequestration is finite. And I think this is sometimes lost when we're talking about storing carbon in soils. And that's because in order to store carbon, we can't break it down, or in order to store organic matter, we can't break it down. Yet organic matter is really important for nutrient cycling and to release nutrients for plant growth. So, so the storage of carbon is really at, I guess, a balance between releasing those nutrients and holding back those nutrients to store it in the ground. And there is a maximum capacity in terms of how much carbon can be stored in soils. And that maximum capacity is kind of like how much water a sponge can hold. So a very dry sponge can hold a lot of water. And much like a highly degraded piece of land can actually has the potential to store a lot of carbon. But if it's well managed, then it can, the carbon storage potential is already relative, or the carbon storage is relatively high, and so the potential is a little bit lower. All of our understanding, or most of our understanding about how carbon cycles through the terrestrial ecosystems has largely stemmed from these long-term experiments at the Rothamsted Research or Rothamsted Experimental Station in the UK. And Rothamsted, I don't know, for me, is kind of like I think the mecca for soil scientists. And I haven't made the pilgrimage. But Rothamsted Experimental Station first planted a series of wheat plots back in 1843. And once they planted the wheat, they took samples every single year, and they're still taking samples now. And so what we know now in terms of how carbon turns over and how carbon is stored in soils stems from these experiments, which started back in 1843. So you can see in terms of this plot that the control treatment, so this orange line, tracks how carbon is, or the concentration of carbon with no amendments. Whereas if we start to add other types of amendments, the potential storage of carbon can increase according to whether you add farmyard manure or nitrogen fertilizer. So a lot of our understanding in terms of how carbon behaves or how carbon cycles in long-term experiments, and they can also track how carbon varies according to different management strategies. What about in Australia? We actually don't have anything like that. So our baseline comes from 2010. And when this organic carbon map was released in 2010, it was a really big deal, largely because we didn't have a continuous map, or we didn't have data which showed carbon storage across Australia without state boundaries. Because remember, when I first started talking about the soil conservation surveys, each state set up its own individual soil conservation survey. So when it comes to mapping soils, we have these really odd lines in our maps, which funnily enough tend to follow these state boundaries. And we know that soils don't automatically change across a state boundary. So our baseline starts in 2010, not in 1843, not in the 1900s, not in the 1940s. So we've only just started to shift towards looking at how we can measure carbon across large scales without or using seamless maps. So where are we now? I've spoken a lot about our land degradation issues and where research has tracked from around the 2000s. So how are we tracking now since those 2000s? We actually don't know. And that's because unlike Rothamsted and unlike other places around the world, we actually don't have any long-term soil monitoring sites. So we can't track how we're going in terms of management and management actions and impacts of changes in land management practices. We also don't have a national soil monitoring network, which is different to other areas around the world as well. And it's also different to other disciplines. So for example, TERN, which has a number of long-term sites to monitor terrestrial ecosystem observations, have a range of long-term monitoring sites around Australia and across different climatic regions. The Bureau of Meteorology, as we know, have a range of long-term sites or a large network, a national network around Australia with long-term sites to measure temperature and rainfall. And there's also gauging stations which measure stream flow. So we have a good handle or reasonable handle on how surface water moves around the landscape. But we don't have that in Australia. So where do we go from here? Because we know that healthy soils are critically important for food and fibre production and for ecosystem services as well. So again, they're critically important for all aspects of our society. So how do we know what we're doing and where we're going? And how do we get there? We do need a national framework to monitor and manage soil condition. And there is some changes afoot in terms of looking at where we're going with that. There is the National Soil Strategy, which is currently in progress and will be released in the near future. And importantly, the Office of the National Soils Advocate has been established. So it was established in July last year, and this office sits in the Prime Minister's Office of the Prime Minister's Cabinet. So there is now recognition at federal government level of how important soils are. So perhaps we can then change that, and we then can monitor and manage soil condition and see where we're going and see how we're tracking in terms of improving our soil health so that we can continue to produce enough food for the growing population, and also to enable those ecosystem services to continue to function in the best way possible. So, and finally, before I finish up, and that's when a whole lot of soils related activities tend to occur. So keep an eye out for various events around World Soil Day as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.